I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Jane Pinelis. Dr. Jane Pinelis is the Chief of AI Assurance at the Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office. She leads a diverse team of testers and analysts in rigorous testing and evaluation for the CDAO capabilities, as well as the development of T&E-specific products and standards to support testing of AI-enabled systems across the DoD. She also leads the team responsible for instantiating responsible AI principles into DoD practices. Prior to joining the CDAO, Dr. Pinelis served as the Director of Test and Evaluation for USDI's Osrimic Warfare Cross-Functional Team, or Project Maven. She directed developmental testing for AI models, including computer vision, machine translation, facial recognition, and natural language processing. Dr. Pinelis is also the co-author of The Experiment of a Lifetime, Doing Science in the Wild for the United States Marine Corps. Dr. Pinelis holds a BS in Statistics, Economics, and Mathematics, an MA in Statistics, and a PhD in Statistics, all from the University of Michigan and Arbor. Dr. Pinelis is joined by Mark Valentine, Head of Federal at Scale. Mark, over to you.
Hey, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Maybe it's good evening. Welcome to TransformX. I hope you're really enjoying the session so far. My name is Mark Valentine, and I lead the federal team here at Scale AI. And I'm really, really excited to continue our exploration of artificial intelligence and national security. And for this session specifically, we're going to explore the topic of building explainable and ethical AI capabilities for national security with a really special guest who I had the opportunity to hear a few months back. And I said, I absolutely want to talk with Jane about this. So to help us understand this critically important topic, we're joined today by Dr. Jane Pinelis. As the title implies, she has a deep academic background in the statistical sciences with a PhD from the University of Michigan. But her knowledge is more than just theory. She is definitely rooted in a lot of practice as well. And she has demonstrated this through a long history with the government. Most recently, she was the director and chief of test and evaluation of AI and ML, both at Johns Hopkins University and then at the Department of Defense's Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, or the JAIC. She is currently the chief of AI assurance for the new Chief Data and AI Office at the Department of Defense. So welcome, Jane.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's my pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Well, I'm really excited about this, as we talked about before. So, Dr. Pinelis, I'd like to start with, obviously, from my brief intro of your bio, I think most of our audience probably knows you from the work you've done at the JAIC, now with the Chief Data and AI Office. But you've been doing this a long time and been helping the DoD work on data-driven outcomes well before we were talking about making heavy investments into AI. So if you could, I'd like to start out with asking you a little bit to share your journey into defense work and what keeps you excited about doing work in this space.
Sure, absolutely. So I started out, I got my PhD in statistics at the University of Michigan. And when you're a statistician, you go to this conference, the Joint Statistical Meetings. It's like 6,000 statisticians in one place. So it's a great deal of fun, at least for some of us. And there's a huge job fair there, right? And so all the grad students would go through all of the interviews. And I think I had something like 14 interviews in 3 days.
Wow.
And most of them, because I'm motivated by more applied problems, I wasn't really interested in a tenure position. And so most of the interviews that I had were either in the financial industry or in the pharmaceutical industry, which is frankly where the money is if you're a statistician. Right. But one place stood out when they first emailed me to schedule an interview with CNA, Center for Naval Analysis, which is a federally funded research and development center, or think tank for the Department of the Navy. And when they emailed me, I had no idea who they were. And I said, okay, sure, we'll talk. And when I heard about the work, it just sounded so very interesting. It was national security work primarily with the Department of the Navy, so both Navy and Marine Corps. And the neat thing that stood out was that they let their analysts go to the field, right? And as a statistician, one of the things you learn very quickly is that statistics is it's a tool. It's a science in and of itself, right? And then the theorists develop that part of the science. But if you're an application type person like myself, the biggest the most fun that you have in statistics is when you're learning all of those applications. And so I said, okay, this is my opportunity to learn about how the Navy and the Marine Corps work through statistics and introduce that kind of academic statistical rigor into the work that they do. And then, being born and raised in the former Soviet Union and having immigrated here with my family when I was 15, it also was a way that I could serve the country that took such good care of my family. And I was very happy to do that. So I ended up spending some time at CNA, about 7 years total. I did work predominantly in the manpower arena, but I also started doing some operational testing. I was called on to help the Navy's operational test and evaluation force at the time to help introduce rigor into their really small experiments, right? So if you can only fire a missile 3 times, or if you can only fly a mission, for a limited amount of time, how do you get the most out of that information? And so I did that for some time, and then I got kind of an opportunity of a lifetime to go and help the Marines with a gender integration experiment that they ran. So this was then Secretary of Defense Panetta lifted the ban on women in combat, and Marine Corps wanted to see how women would perform on physically demanding tasks and whether the women's performance would frankly hurt mission in the end of the day or result in injuries, or if gender integration in those kind of ground combat jobs was good to go. And so I spent about 15 months with Marines, largely in the field, designing, conducting, and leading a team to analyze this experiment, to write up our findings. This resulted in a 1,000-page long report, but for me, it also resulted in really appreciating what Marines do for a living. So after I finished my time at CNA, I ended up spending some time at IDA, Institute for Defense Analysis, which is also a think tank that supports the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation. And so there I really got a chance to see what is testing like from an OSD perspective, not from the services necessarily, but from the guidance and the policy and that kind of a high view. And then I ended up with an opportunity to work at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, which is a university-affiliated research center. And there we did a variety of things, anything from nuclear nonproliferation work to Navy mental health to synthetic biology. But ultimately, where it led me is an opportunity to work on Project Maven. And Project Maven at the time was the biggest investment that DoD had made into AI. And so there was opportunity again to go to the field, to go right to the Pentagon and embed with that team and lead their test and evaluation practice, which basically the idea was that there were multiple vendors submitting models to Maven, and how do you figure out which one is best for the purpose, right? And how do you figure out if any of them are effective, frankly? And so when General Shanahan left Maven and moved over to found the Joint AI Center, I got an opportunity to follow him there and establish their test and evaluation practice more, again, kind of at OSD level rather than focused on any specific project, and figure out what the issues were and what was missing. And then since then, we have now evolved and kind of progressed and incorporated responsible AI with test and evaluation. And so together, those two branches combine into AI Assurance Branch, which is what I run at CDAO now.
That's awesome. And I want to follow up with that. But what I find interesting about your discussion is what brought you to work on these hard problems in the Department of Defense to begin with, is that idea that you could actually go in the field. So I'm now going to say that Dr. Jane Pinelis is to statistics what Indiana Jones was to archaeology.
Awesome. I really appreciate that.
That's right.
I quote you.
That's phenomenal. And like I said, this gets to one of the other topics I wanted to talk about is whenever we talk about artificial intelligence and national security, I think people's minds, they focus on three things: the Matrix, Terminator, and Slaughterbots. And because of that, the idea of AI ethics, I think, is central, or at least should be central to just about every discussion about artificial intelligence. And I know that you've been at the middle of this set of work to establish policy frameworks to guide the adoption of AI that reflects really our nation's values. And the Department of Defense has made it clear that these AI ethical principles are really, they're guided by a bunch of longstanding ethics, legal, and policy principles at the heart of really everything we do. And this kind of scratches my itch. And I think you mentioned this earlier, is oftentimes we think of AI as like this new thing, and maybe it is, but really we've had these frameworks around how to deal with data and how to deal with test and evaluation for a long time. So it appears that we're modifying those. So I'd like to take a few minutes, and if you could help our audience understand, how these principles were developed, what they are, what the ultimate goal is. I think that'd be valuable.
Sure, yes. And I don't want to take too much credit, right? Most of this was done by my colleagues or other people inside and outside of my organization. But having said that, the principles were first adopted in February 2020. We were the first military to do so. And so at the time, the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, now the CDAO, was tasked with leading the coordination of oversight and implementation of these principles across the department. And really, the principles are built upon the essential foundations that we have, right? Like the U.S. Constitution, Title 10 of U.S. Code, privacy and civil liberties, and those types of democratic values. But there is, of course, some ambiguity and some novelty and risks, frankly, having to do with the design, development, procurement, deployment of AI. They can contribute to the concerns that the public has, right? And certainly to the killer robot kind of view of what we're doing.
That's right.
And so we're rooted in the deep history of democratic values and longstanding international norms, but we did write them down to address kind of some of that novelty. And so there are 5 principles. They're fairly easy, I think, to understand at this point. The first one is responsible. And the responsible principle really has to do with the human that's using the technology and exercising that appropriate level of judgment for development and deployment and use of the capabilities. Then we have a principle of equitability. This has to do with unintended bias in AI capabilities. Sure. And of course, there are things to contrast it with intended bias, right? If I intend to operate a system in the desert, I can absolutely bias it to perform the best in the desert. Right. But especially with systems that involve, humans and decisions about humans' careers, for instance, that's when unintended bias is especially critical to minimize, to mitigate, potentially to avoid where we can. Then we have a principle of traceability. And really, this has to do with the fact that there are multiple stakeholders in the AI process, and all of them have a certain level of appropriate understanding of the technology, how it was developed, how it might operate. And we have to provide a level of basic transparency into our technology. It doesn't have to be complete, and different people have different requirements for it. But in the end of the day, our methods, our data sources, we have to have a certain level of auditability and provenance. Then we have the principle of reliability. And in this case, reliability to us means that we have clearly defined use cases. We have tested for things like safety and security and effectiveness. So the warfighter basically has to be able to rely on their equipment. And then finally, we have a principle of governability. And this really has to do with minimizing any kind of unintended consequences and the fact that we must have the ability to disengage the technology and notice and mitigate any kind of unintended behavior. So again, we didn't want within the DoD to kind of encourage the development of entirely new principles. These came following a 15-month study by the Defense Innovation Board. And they've been now not only formally and publicly adopted by our DoD, but also multiple other militaries have followed, and certainly our own intelligence community has followed as well.
Yeah, indeed. And I do want to get to the partner aspect here in a minute. But before we move there, I know that the Department of Defense published its responsible AI strategy and the implementation pathway in June, so just a few months ago. What's been going on in the last couple of months, and what can we expect to see on the horizon in the next year or so?
So that's right. In June, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Dr. Hicks, signed out our strategy and implementation pathway. And that is really now our overarching guidance for implementation. It's also posted on AI.mil if anybody wants to read it. It's very publicly facing. And it really details our strategic approach for advancing AI and operationalizing the principles. It talks about operationalizing AI across 6 different tenets. The first one is responsible AI governance. So we have the responsibility to introduce the right governance structure and processes, both at the component and DoD levels, to make sure that our guidelines and policies are followed and we can hold people accountable. The second tenet is warfighter trust. So that one really has to do with test and evaluation and conveying that information to the warfighter, as well as integrating kind of runtime monitoring capabilities and taking into account what happens to these systems post-deployment and how we collect warfighter feedback once the systems have been fielded. The third one has to do with our acquisition life cycle. And
everyone's favorite topic.
I'm sure. So as everybody on the line knows, it's been a very tough process for us to adapt our own acquisition processes to this new technology that's really requires kind of an agile iterations, that requires user involvement early on. And so we're working on a lot of tools, policies, and systems and processes that will make this easier. The fourth tenet, I lost count there, is requirements validation. And the idea here is that responsible AI must become a joint performance requirement generator and has to be properly incorporated into the Joint Requirements Oversight Council type processes. The fifth tenet has to do with the responsible AI ecosystem, and that's really the idea that we, the American DoD, will serve to advance global norms grounded in our shared values. It has to do a lot with our partnerships, whether it's intergovernmental, whether it's academic, industry collaborations, but also allies and like-minded nations. And then finally, last but definitely not least, is our AI workforce. And the idea is that this is a very new career field, and there's a lot of talent planning, recruiting, and capability building there that we have to do. So that's a rough summary of the pathway, right? And there's a lot of work that's kind of detailed that both CDAO and components are responsible for within it. Now what are we planning to accomplish in the near term? When we look at the pathway, I think what's ultimately missing is best practices and kind of guidance, but also tools to actually implement, right? Because we can issue guidance all day, but unless you provide tools by which people can implement, we're going to have a hard time. And so tools is a really big focus for us this year. We actually have commissioned a study to figure out the needs and the landscape and the roadmap for the kind of tools that we will need, and frankly, who needs them. And because we need tools not just for developers, we need tools for practitioners, for program managers, for senior leaders, for acquisition personnel, etc. Then we're tackling workforce pretty hard, and we're doing so through our educational effort. Again, it's a very new career field, and so we need to nurture both the workforce that we have internal to the DoD and potentially upskill some of that workforce, but also we need to build a strong base of responsible AI practitioners across that ecosystem, in academia, in industry, and otherwise. And so a year from now, and I'm nervous because this is being recorded, so I'll be held accountable for this, but a year from now, what we want to do is really mature and expand some of our offerings and guidance. We intend to have a minimally viable product of our suite of responsible AI tools, as well as hopefully a formalized community of responsible AI practitioners.
Indeed. Well, I happen to know a company that can help you with that, but we'll talk about that later. Uh, some of the things that you were talking about with the responsible AI principles, and by the way, I've been involved in this for a while, and I've been able to watch it grow and mature. Uh, they all line up, whether it's countering bias, building trust with users. It all lines up to me to building that trust, and there's a line in the responsible AI framework that says responsible AI is a journey to trust. And I love that statement. And it goes on to talk about how we can't view responsible AI as a destination that we reach and then we can all just congratulate ourselves and say we're done because we've crossed the finish line. But it's really a cycle. And we're going to be constantly evolving around this. How's that being accepted within the Department of Defense, which quite frankly has kind of a more of a linear product development mindset where start with the waterfall requirements process, complete a widget at this point, and then declare victory and now go on to the next project. So can you give us an understanding how DoD is approaching this practically, given that it seems to be a bit of a culture shift?
Yeah, it's definitely a culture shift. And, I have a love hate relationship with the word trust specifically because it's really hard to define, right? I mean, there's the warfighter kind of trust that their equipment will work. There is more of like a nation kind of trust that we're not making killer robots. There's our international allies kind of trust, that our systems won't have unintended consequences and things like that. So trust is very hard to define, but its kind of overarching nature, I think, works well for specifically responsible AI because that's also overarching. And it's our approach to design, development, deployment, and utilization, right? And the
Right.
idea that we've somehow ensured the safety of our systems and their ethical employment. And so a responsible AI for us covers anything through, ethical guidelines, testing standards, accountability checks, having that feedback loop from the human once the system is deployed, which necessitates really good human system integration, and then safety considerations, which actually the DoD is fairly strong with. We have a few very good safety frameworks in place, but they have not necessarily included AI. And so we're participating very actively in rewriting some of that guidance. And so some of it is culture shift, especially the agile piece. I know the test community for a long time has been talking about integrated tests or bringing operational testers into the beginning of that process and incorporating users into the beginning of that process. I think with AI, that becomes even more important because any kind of a big operational test at the end of development, which is how we're used to doing things, really precludes you from localizing and diagnosing issues and having enough time to fix them. And so I think people are shifting. Some of it is taking longer, especially I think with the DoD bureaucracy kind of established in that waterfall, a very linear fashion that you mentioned before. But some of it, again, is not new. Like the safety considerations they're maybe slightly unique with AI, but they're not terribly new. And it's a matter of just updating existing guidance, which we're working
Yeah. So I was actually going to ask you about that because I've been involved in the test evaluation of weapon systems during my military career. I was going to ask you if you see any analogies between that ecosystem of activities and what you're doing now, and I think the answer is yes. But that infrastructure, that pathway, I think is so defined. So how are you building like an analogous set of infrastructure, test evaluation regimes, locations, people that keep humans in the loop so that we can ensure these principles are being met and that programs and models and algorithms are ultimately doing what they're supposed to and not doing what they're not supposed to?
Yeah, so I'll add that third piece actually to what you just said, which is when we talk about what a trustworthy system is, and I can't take credit for the statement, but I just think it's awesome, so I keep repeating it. A trustworthy system, when used correctly, does what it's supposed to do. When used correctly, doesn't do what it's not supposed to do. And then it also assumes that we've trained the human to use it correctly, right?
That's right.
Which is really key, I think, to all of this. And so that kind of assurance is exactly why we've moved into an AI assurance kind of space rather than just a test and evaluation space at CDAO. And the reason we've done that is, one of the reasons we've done that is that AI assurance leaves room for multiple stakeholders in the process.
Right.
Right. So test and evaluation traditionally, as you know, you do the test, you write a report, it goes to DOT&E, and you're done. With AI, we've really identified that it's particularly important to assure multiple stakeholders of different things. So the warfighter, for instance, needs to have the system meet technical requirements, perhaps some operational requirements as well. They need to have a justified confidence and kind of data-informed trust in that system. Perhaps they need predictability, right? If I press this button, then it will do something. And by the way, there's a huge human factors piece to evaluating whether that's the case, and then calibrating the human trust around it. But we also have other stakeholders in the process. We have the American taxpayer, right, who wants to make sure we're not building killer robots, and we have to be responsible with our investments. We have our international partners as well, and like-minded nations, and we have to be interoperable, for instance, and things like that. So AI assurance is really built around being able to identify the different stakeholders and then tailor our arguments and evidence to those stakeholders. But within that, test and evaluation, and especially human factors, is just an enormous and very central piece. And we at CDAO have a very robust human system integration framework that is directly tied to the OODA loop, right? So we evaluate the idea that the human has the type of information they need at the right time in a way that they understand, for instance. We have more technical terms for it, like situational awareness and information quality, but that's the two first O's of the OODA loop, right? And then the decide piece of the OODA loop, can I actually make a good decision about when to use the system to accomplish my goal? Well, that's all warfighter trust and warfighter reliance on their equipment. And what's really interesting about the way that we have to test is that we have to incorporate free play. Right, so traditionally in the DoD, the test is completely scripted, and the warfighter has to use whatever equipment they're given, like a tank, to accomplish their mission. With AI, we have to give them the option not to, right? Because if they don't trust the system, then we need to be able to measure that. So that's the decide kind of piece of the OODA loop. And there are other important aspects of it, like calibrating their workload and allocating the functions properly between human and the machine, right? So that would be part of the ACT kind of piece of the OODA loop, and figuring out, for instance, we tend to automate things that are easiest to automate, but that often can leave the human with the hardest tasks and without context. So that's actually not the optimal way to do it.
Indeed.
And so it's really important to use T&E to calibrate the warfighter trust in the system, but also to identify any kind of performance problems early on so that they can be fixed.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Pinelis, as a recovering fighter pilot and adherent to John Boyd, you had me at UDA. So thanks for that. I do want to take a step back, though. Earlier, you mentioned partner nations. So obviously, we were, I think, the U.S. Department of Defense was the first to set a kind of a set of globally recognized ethical principles, but others are now following suit. And let's be honest, we have strategic competitors that may not have the exact same understanding of or maybe limitations on how they use AI. So can you talk a little bit about the evolution of our responsible AI kind of defense policy vis-a-vis our allies and potentially even competitors?
Absolutely. So within kind of our ecosystem, right? First of all, we consider the broad ecosystem, but also we talk about industry, academia, and our acquisition partners, as well as international allies. And so in September of 2020, then the JAIC established the AI Partnership for Defense. And that was aimed at providing values-based global leadership for adoption of AI in defense. Right now, this partnership consists of 16 members. And so we're focused on promoting and advancing responsible development and usage of AI-enabled technologies, as well as governance and policy. And so most of our meetings, which are about 3 to 4 times a year, very heavily focused specifically on AI assurance, but also on AI test and evaluation. We engage in knowledge sharing, artifact creation, policy coordination in some cases, as well as collaborative engagements. meant really to improve interoperability. And in this past June, for instance, the UK Ministry of Defence, or MOD, launched their own defence artificial intelligence strategy, along with their standalone ethics policy document called Ambitious, Safe, Responsible AI, at the UK AI Summit. And so, again, it's a very joint venture. If you read their principles, they're very analogous to ours. There are some subtle differences that are very interesting to analyze, and that's what we do in our free time. But generally speaking, they're very well aligned, and so there's going to be a wealth of lessons learned from our kind of AI transformation that we did still in the Jake with them, but also as these partner nations establish and promote their own strategies and implementations. We obviously are active in the AUKUS space as well, and we're testing some really interesting interoperability problems, as well as our shared principles under the auspices of that partnership too.
Excellent. Awesome. Well, Dr. Pinelis, I know we're getting close to the end of our time, and on behalf of the entire TransformX audience, I want to thank you for your time. And I understand we have a huge task in front of us, and you specifically leading AI assurance efforts at the Department of Defense. And you, the team, have done some phenomenal things. We've talked about some of those, and yet big challenges remain. So I'd like to end up with kind of a final question. How can industry help you and your team? What do you see as the role that we can provide, or that we in industry can provide to help DoD develop that culture that adopts responsible AI effectively?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a few things I'll say here. At the 2021 DoD AI Symposium, we announced an RFI through our procurement ecosystem called Tradewind. And what we're really looking for from industry is to provide input on knowledge that already exists, tools, services, and any kind of solutions to advance responsible AI implementation over the 6 tenets that I mentioned earlier. We've now made sure that from an acquisition standpoint, we've established the kind of entry points that we can engage in contractually, right? And so please reach out to us. We have no time to reinvent the wheel, and we know that there is a wealth of knowledge and tools already existing in industry, right? We also know that we're short on personnel, and so that makes the idea that our personnel have to have tools even more important. So please reach out. We will take demos. We will talk. We will learn from you. We're very excited to collaborate in a variety of ways. But one other thing I'll mention as kind of a parting comment to address your previous question, which is, what are our adversaries doing? And in truth, we know that our adversaries probably are willing to bypass some of the costs, both time and financial, that are associated with AI assurance and ethical AI as they prioritize fielding systems faster. Right. And so it becomes very important to us also that we field with what Mike Horowitz calls responsible speed. I really like that term. And so we need to get to automation. We need to get to high powered compute as soon as possible. And then one last idea that I'll leave you with is that even though our adversaries may be able to field in some cases faster, ultimately responsible AI test and evaluation and AI assurance, these are all actual tools in our toolkit to provide more robust systems, right? And when we have more robust systems, we actually have an asymmetric advantage. If we have systems that are more effective, systems that our warfighters and our public trust, in the end of the day, that's a large advantage that we should absolutely consider when making these risk-benefit types of trade-offs of, do we really need to be fastest, or can we just be fast enough and be better?
That's right. No, that's great. I love that concept of responsible speed. I think you're exactly right. So, Dr. Pinelis, Jane, thank you so much for your time. No kidding, this has been an awesome conversation from my perspective. I've learned so much. I'm sure that our audience has as well. And to our audience, thank you for your time and thank you for your attention. I hope that you're enjoying TransformX, and I hope to see you all soon. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.